Hey, hope everybody is great. Hey, Ed. It feels somewhat surreal to be as prosaic with you to say, "Hey, Ed," but hey, Ed, how are you?
I'm great. And it's good to be with you. Ed is fine, by the way. People sort of see a distance there, but the important thing to remember is everybody is somebody. I'm just a normal guy. I just happen to be in a strange situation.
Fair enough. Just to add, because this is often a serious conversation that we end up having about the intersection of the autonomy and agency of the individual with the ascendance over the past little while of the surveillance state. So I want to introduce some levity at the outset, just so the audience can connect with you as a human, and I can connect with you as a human being. What is the experience like of being, and then we can get into more of the seriousness. What is the experience like, and I hope you take this kindly, of being played by a Hollywood actor?
you know, it's it's really strange. I had the chance to meet JGL, who played me in the Snowden movie. Of course, I played myself in the actual documentary when it was happening. Um, but he's a very talented, very kind guy. It's incredibly flattering to have someone like that, play you in a film. It's very strange, though. It's you can't really watch somebody pretend to be you in a film and not be a little bit unsettled by it. I think, particularly when he does like a Batman voice through the thing.
Yeah, I can imagine, and I'm going to somehow elegantly segue that into a more serious topic, which is when JGL was, filming Third Rock from the Sun. This is like the direct period prior to. I really want to talk about um, getting into that period to frame and understand for our conversation, and also to frame and understand for the audience the period of time after September 11th, and how that set up the context for what I personally think was the beginning of a little bit of a counter narrative to the benevolence of the nation state, at least in the context of the U.S. and other Western democracies. Uh, so I think that 8-year period was incredibly important to where we are now, and I wonder how you feel about that. I want to know, in terms of crypto coming into being and discourses about surveillance capitalism finding their feet. What do you think about this time period and how it affected you prior to where the reason for you being here today, really?
Yeah, I mean, when we were sort of growing up, people of our age cohort, in that period, everything felt amazing. And then as we aged, it seemed that everything, fell apart. And, nobody is capable of governing. There's conflict everywhere. There's all kinds of cultural and moral panics. But the funny thing is, I've been blessed to be able to talk to activists from previous generations, like Daniel Ellsberg, people who lived through the civil rights protests of the last century, the Vietnam era resistance, and whistleblowers working against the sort of top secret America construction, as the Washington Post might put it, when it was in its infancy. And the thing is, when you have the benefit of that perspective, you see that what we feel like is in fact some new dynamic that didn't exist previously, everything's falling apart today, would actually be very fiercely contended by people who come at it from a different perspective. And we actually see a lot of that today in the sort of cultural conflicts that we face today, where people say we're looking at this from the wrong perspective, or from the wrong continent, or from the wrong color, or what have you. Everybody sees the world through a different lens. Now, what I will say is different is the way that this struggle for power is expressed. When we're talking about things like the civil rights protests, you're talking about water hoses and dogs and men in boots with sticks, right? You're talking about state governors and local laws and really oppression that is hyperlocal. Why? Because that's the technology that they had. What changed in that post 9/11 moment, in September of 2001 and onwards, is in response to a cultural panic that arose from an act of terrorism, which it's important to understand. We lose more people to COVID than we ever did from September 11th, but September 11th changed national policy for 2 decades. In very harmful ways. We went to wars that we could never extricate ourselves from. And most importantly, we reinterpreted the Constitution of the United States, what all of our laws meant, in secret. And the government then applied a new framework of technology to enforce their understanding of our rights and our laws in a new way. Now, in the previous century and all the centuries prior, this was not possible, right? The extent of the government's authority really came from where its voice could reach through media influence and where its hands could physically reach through its agents, right? Those people wearing boots and carrying sticks. Now, for the first time, they were able to take control of an infrastructure that had already begun to work its way into every home, into every workplace, and now into every pocket. We have to remember that smartphones weren't omnipresent back then. That would come years later. But the infrastructure upon which those smartphones would operate was already there. And this is what really changed, I think, in a historic way. The United States government operated in secret with a first mover advantage that it then shared in secret with the Five Eyes intelligence network. This is the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, sort of the Anglophone countries. And then they worked in an open, admitted conspiracy in government documents, and they say it in public since, to basically try to establish what they would describe as information dominance on the internet. Now, this was justified on the basis of terrorism, but 10 years and now 20 years later, when we look at the government's own investigations, they found that these programs were not especially effective in stopping terrorist attacks. What they were extraordinarily effective for was generating intelligence, right? And this makes sense to anybody who uses the internet in the most peripheral way. Think about it. If you could just type in anyone's email address and see what's in there, right? If you could type in anyone's IP address and see which sites they're connecting to, if you could look at someone's the connection data that's traveling from their cell phone, not even to see what's in it, but just to see this cell phone becomes active at this time of day and it becomes less active at this time of night. Well, now you know when they wake up. Now you know when they go to sleep. And if you could see this device move over the network, you know everywhere they move. Now, if you extrapolated that over everyone, everywhere, now you have the birth of what was in 2013 described as global mass surveillance. And that is what I would say is uniquely different and has changed in our generation.
Yeah, I sometimes I'll segue into the next question that I have, but I sometimes I almost want to skip ahead and say and we'll get to this I think more in a later talk, but the state's monopoly on the use of violence. Before we segue into this next question, I mean, it's after hearing you say this, it's almost like it's transmogrified into a use of violence on the information contained by the individual. Does that land for you?
I mean, we would have to describe, what is violence in this context? Are we talking, the iPhone jumping off the table and biting you? Of course, no. But are we talking about the fact that now, previously, if the state wanted to disrupt a protest movement, they had to infiltrate the protest movement, right? They had to figure out who the influencers are within it. They had to see who were the people who connected that protest movement to other protest movements. They had to basically identify the leadership on the social graph, right? The nodes that connect all of the other nodes, and then take those nodes off the board, arrest them, intimidate them, co-opt them, whatever they could do. And that took time. It took an enormous investment of people. It was not always successful. Well, now your iPhone already does that for you, right? They're constantly feeding that information, not just to the government, but to Apple, to Facebook, to Google, to whoever's running the apps and the SDKs that are resident on your phone. Now, once you have that, can it be used to instrumentalize violence? Of course. At the same time, do we see that being commonly used to apply violence in the context, at least domestically, of the United States today? Not broadly. Do they do it in targeted instances? Absolutely. Anybody that they really don't like, we see it happen. But can it be applied in other ways, right? When you talk about violence, what we're talking about here is forcefully overcoming the absence of consent. What if they didn't have to do it forcefully? And that's what they're trying to realize, right? And because, like, why is Apple, why are Facebook, why are all these guys interested in this? They don't want to hit you with a stick. They can't. In theory, they'll go to jail. Probably not in today's world. But they're certainly not supposed to do it. But if they can influence the way you think, if they understand your entire social graph, they can influence the people that influence you. If they can insert into your timeline, right, of your doom scrolling or whatever, the headlines that you see, and they know that you don't click half of the articles that you see, you just see the headlines, they can shape your perception of the world, and then they no longer even need to apply violence. So really, what we see is violence becoming more of a continuum where it's not really about violence. Violence is the end state of influence. It's where all their other influence operations have failed, and now they're going to the last resort. But if they can use it as an increasingly smaller or an increasingly scarce lever, something that when used is then amplifies to the media to scare everybody else into compliance because they know, I don't want to end up like that guy. It can still be effective even when you only pull the stick out on very rare occasions.
True enough, and agreed. When we catch up, to the winter and spring of 2013, I've always just, and maybe I hope this is not a duplication of efforts on your part that you've already explained this, but I've always just want to know, sort of for you to take me through the thoughts in your head when you decided to share this aspect of, the state that people probably had their eyes closed to, and it certainly resonated with me when you said everything was great. I felt like everything, like, I assume you're talking about the mid 90s.
Right. Yeah. And like the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace era, where everybody who talked about the internet, everyone who wrote about the internet, like it was an obvious, unmitigated good. It was a space, a new commons of the mind where we would all come to meet, we would all construct and collaborate together. And governments were seen as sort of interlopers into this space. Corporations were not really welcome in this space. It was a public commons because it had yet to be privatized and commercialized.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny to me how you could almost draw an analog with blockchain to some extent within that kind of frameworks. But let's catch up to this because I want to just really kind of understand like when you what was your emotional state like, and I guess, yeah, catch up to crypto in the sense that I understand recently, that I think you released something about paying for the servers in BTC. What was the intersection of crypto at that time for you, and when did you first get into crypto and BTC, and what was that journey like? And I obviously it intersected with your journey of the leaks, and I'm curious about that whole milieu.
So There are a lot of questions in there. I think you asked generally about like my mental state in 2013, like what brought me forward. What it was I was working for the government as a contractor, but people think I worked at like a Booz Allen building in Hawaii or something like that. That's not really how top secret contracting works. You work in an NSA facility at an NSA desk under an NSA supervisor who has a blue badge, and the contractors simply have green badges, right? You're all part of the same team. You're all working on the same missions. You're all fulfilling the same tasks, essentially. It's just the government has legally regulated manpower caps on how many people can staff these executive agencies. And so they have to basically pay private companies to rent their employees to get around this cap, right? It's entirely an end run around Congress, where as long as they have the budget to rent people, they can violate these manpower caps by taking people who are nominally working for Dell or Booz Allen or whatever, but in practice, their de facto work is for government. And so that's what I was doing. And in my position there, I was working at something called the Office of Information Sharing. So I had to have all of the information. And so I had very broad accesses. I could see basically everything, and I was supposed to get people what they needed. I wasn't ever intended to actually end up in this position. It's a sort of one of the strange coincidences of history I wrote about in my book, Permanent Record, if anybody's interested in the minutiae there. But I came across a classified Inspector General's report that was still in the draft stage. This is a government investigation of itself into what was called the Stellarland program. Now, this was very unusual because this is basically a classified compartment, something called ECI, exceptionally controlled information, which you can think of as sort of as an above top secret thing. Not everybody who has clearance, even if they have the clearance to see it, is permitted to see it. And this is above and beyond normal controls, right? So we have these things called dirty word searches that people like myself, people with systems administration access, can construct to go, if you ever see this word on the system, and you may not even know what the word means, flag that file, pull it over, look at it. If it's in fact not supposed to be there, get rid of it. And so I got the results of one of these dirty word searches, and I saw this document that was way too highly classified to be where it was. And when I read it, what it said was that the government was knowingly, willfully violating the law. They were very likely violating the Constitution of the United States. And only a few members of Congress were aware of this. But the ones that did went along with it because they were afraid of being criticized. The courts were not interjecting in this, even though it was being challenged by things like the American Civil Liberties Union. Because they went, well, the government says it's classified and they're the authority on national security. So who are we to question the executive branch's judgment on whether it's national security related or not? And what had happened when you look at this in aggregate is that the government had found a way to hack around the limitations that our society had imposed on them. They'd gotten around law, they had gotten around oversight, they'd gotten around the Constitution. How did we reestablish that? And what I felt was that we, the public, even if we wanted this to happen, or we didn't want this to happen, we needed to know that it was happening in order to discuss it, right? In order to vote on it, in order to express the will of the governed. And that was being intentionally, willfully denied to us. So that, was something that obviously made me uncomfortable because I know what happens to people who stand up and say something about this. So it was really the end of my life as I knew it, and I thought I would end up in prison. I was not excited to do this. This was not something I wanted to do. And I knew it was going to mean that I would spend the rest of my life really in grim circumstances. Things have actually ended up better than that, but it's still not exactly what you would hope for. Anyway, again, for people who want more on that, I would refer you to my book because we've got time limitations here tonight. But to get to that second part of the question that you had there, which I don't know if you want to restate it just to bring our listeners back in because we went pretty far there. I've actually lost audio from you. Are you on mute?
Yeah, my apologies.
Okay, no worries.
I actually also just wanted to know, I guess you touched on it a little bit in terms of how, in terms of how you saw it playing out 8 years later, and some differences in how you saw it playing out as opposed to what you felt then. But I really also wanted to kind of jump into the intersection of blockchain, crypto.
Right.
At that time, Bitcoin is really is
Right.
synonymous with crypto, and I really wanted to get us, like, you're buying these servers,
Yeah.
with BTC. I remember paying for some VPNs with BTC back in the day, and
Right.
I'm very remiss that I did this.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
You know,
it's lamentable.
God,
But
if I thought
yeah,
about how much those servers cost today, like hundreds of thousands of dollars, uh, but
yeah,
it's worth it, and I would have done it again. It helps get traction for the fact that the internet can have its own currency, um, and more importantly, uh, it would not have been possible uh, to basically do this the way that I had intended to do it, where I divorced it from my identity for a period of time, right? I wasn't going in and buying Bitcoin from somebody in the coffee shop, although I should have been back then, because I didn't have time. And I had been using Bitcoin for the longest time to pay for servers, as you mentioned, for contributing to technical efforts against censorship with the Tor network for years. I
I
think
remember.
probably I had been involved since 2011. I'm not sure um, in actively using it. Uh, but yeah, it was just simply a circumstance where I go, oh man, now I need to basically create one degree of separation. They would be able to find out eventually because I wasn't trying to, again, do this in complete secrecy. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to pick up days. I wanted to pick up weeks. And, if you're paying for a server in a completely foreign country with a completely foreign currency from the perspective of the FBI, that buys you time. And it worked, right? A lot of people today would go, oh my goodness, this is scary. This is terrible. We don't want Bitcoin to be involved in speech crimes or whatever. But it is that ungovernable space that represents a need, right? Some people were talking about, like back then, the Silk Road and drug markets. And
Mhm.
nowadays, when everybody's trying to go, oh, Bitcoin is the most legitimate thing in the world, you can put your baby to bed on Bitcoin. They go, oh, we can't mention the tragic past. Um, Look, I'm not saying we want open air drug markets. A lot of you will say you do, and that's fine. That's a different debate. Um, but what I am saying is that what does it mean if nobody is able to engage in any kind of trade? No one is able to speak without the government's permission. And this is really what I want to sort of summarize here. When we talk about that track from the Declaration of Independence to cyberspace, to really the post 9/11 declaration of the subjugation or subordination of cyberspace. Um, what September 11th represented from the intelligence community's perspective was the discovery of Pandora's box. The intelligence community had recognized that this new global network was spreading everywhere, but legally, lawfully, they were not able to surveil it the way that they surveilled, like satellite communications and whatnot, that weren't really generally used by the public. Because it would involve domestic surveillance. They'd be spying on everyone everywhere, whether they live in, Detroit or whether they live, in Berlin. But when they found this, it was simply too attractive to walk away from. So they found their way in, they opened it up, and now we're dealing with all of the evils that are sort of left behind. But the last thing remaining in Pandora's box, if you remember the old fable, was hope. And that's what we have to recognize today. This infrastructure is out there. It is being targeted. The network and the path that our communications must traverse is hostile. But so are many paths that we walk in life, whether it's a dark alley or anything else. Can we design methods to re-liberate the internet? And I think we can. If we do not recognize that there are places that the government may rightfully have an interest in regulating and want to regulate this for whatever reason, anti-monopoly or whatever or they're trying to get terrorists or kidnappers, or saving the puppies. Whatever you actually approve of, you recognize there may be some use for government there. We also have to recognize that governments inevitably will go too far. They will abuse their power. They will abuse their authority. How do we regulate the regulators? And this, I think, is one of the interesting things that originally attracted me to the idea of sort of the distributed ledger, which is that you don't have to trust the central authority with all of the power. What if we basically put power out on the table and anybody could come up and take their little piece of it and take it back home and through their own responsibility, through their own investment, create a larger fabric, a larger network, a safety net that's held by 10,000 people as opposed to by 10, sitting in an unaccountable room somewhere where we don't even know what they're talking about. That is a scary prospect to governments. And it's scary to a lot of people who have not been involved in it, who don't understand how it works, who see it as a threat. And it's certainly a threat to a lot of bankers out there. It's frightening to them because they've been extracting rents for the last 1,000 years on the basis that only they were the ones who were invested with the authority to do this. But we can use science and technology, our understanding of mathematics as we develop as a species, to find ways that we can work collaboratively and cooperatively, even under hostile circumstances and difficult environments, to build something better. And I think that is the hope that's left in the box.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that there's always a devolution towards special interest if the overall framework for the dynamics of power is set as it is now. And if we can, iterate upon that via governance mechanisms within blockchain technologies, for example, or a more equitable value transfer layer that we're building right now through cryptocurrencies and otherwise, then I think that this is an optimistic avenue. And it's also a time for us, I think, to maybe pause, because we're going to bring someone into the conference here, and I won't say who it is. I'll leave that for our host, who I think is very germane to that discussion, and I cannot wait until I can talk to both of you at once. So we'll wait for their introduction. And thank you for this time, Ed. I can call you Ed.
My pleasure.
You'd let me. Okay. And thank you for this time. And we'll take a little break and introduce our next guest.
Be right back. Thank you so much.